revolution. All that, inshallah, we're going to answer tonight. But I think first we should start off with the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran. And the person who will recite the Quran for us tonight is Brother Kamal. So if we could please welcome him up with the salawat.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فسبحان الله حين تمسون وحين تصبحون، وله الحمد في السماوات والأرض وعشيا وحين تظهرون، يخرج الحي من الميت ويخرج الميت من الحي ويحيي الأرض بعد موتها وكذلك تخرجون. ومن آياته أن خلقكم من تراب ثم إذا أنتم بشر تنتشرون. ومن آياته أن خلق لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها وجعل بينكم مودة ورحمة، إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يتفكرون. ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم، إن في ذلك لآيات للعالمين. ومن آياته منامكم بالليل والنهار وابتغاؤكم من فضله، إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يسمعون. ومن آياته يريكم البرق خوفا وطمعا وينزل من السماء ماء فيحيي به الأرض بعد موتها، إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يعقلون. ومن آياته أن تقوم السماء والأرض بأمره، ثم إذا دعاكم دعوة من الأرض إذا أنتم تخرجون. وله من في السماوات والأرض كل له قانتون، وهو الذي يبدأ الخلق ثم يعيده وهو أهون عليه، وله المثل الأعلى في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم. ضرب لكم مثلا من أنفسكم، هل لكم مما ملكت أيمانكم من شركاء فيما رزقناكم فأنتم فيه سواء تخافونهم كخيفتكم أنفسكم، كذلك نفصل الآيات لقوم يعقلون. بل اتبع الذين ظلموا أهواءهم بغير علم، فمن يهدي من أضل الله وما لهم من ناصرين. فأقم وجهك للدين حنيفا، فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها، لا تبديل لخلق الله، ذلك الدين القيم ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون. In the name of Allah, Beneficent, Merciful. So exalted is Allah when you reach the evening and when you reach the morning. And to Him is due all praise throughout the heavens and the earth. And exalted is he at night and when you are at noon. He brings the living out of the dead, and brings the dead out of the living, and brings to life the earth after its lifelessness. And thus you will be brought about. And of his signs is that he created you from dust. Then, suddenly, you were human beings dispersing throughout the earth. And of his signs is that he created for you from yourselves mates, that you may find tranquility in them, and he placed between you affection and mercy. Indeed, in that are signs for a people who give thought. And of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs for those of knowledge. And of his signs is your sleep by night and day, and your seeking of his bounty. Indeed, in that are signs of a people who listen. And of his signs is that he shows you the lightning, causing fear and aspiration, and he sends down rain from the night, by which he brings to life the earth after its lifelessness. Indeed, in that are signs for a people who use reason. And of his signs is that the heaven and the earth remain by his command. Then when he calls you with a single call from the earth, immediately you will come forth. And to him belongs whoever is in the heavens and the earth. All are to him devoutly obedient. And it is he who begins creation, and then he repeats it, and that is even easier for him. To him belongs the highest attribute in the heavens and the earth, and it is he who is exalted in might and is the wise. He presents to you an example from yourselves. Do you have among those whom your right hands possess any partners in what we have provided for you, so that you are equal therein, and would fear them as you fear of one another within a partnership? Thus do we detail the verses for a people who use reason. But those who wrong follow their own desires without knowledge. Then who can guide whom Allah has sent astray? And for them are no helpers. So direct your face toward the religion, inclining to truth. Adhere to the nature of Allah, upon which He has created all people. No change should there be in the creation of Allah. That is the correct religion, but most of the people do not know. Sadaqallahu al-Aliyyul Azim.
Excellent. For the health of Brother Kamel and his family and the preservation of his beautiful voice, let's recite one more salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So, online, if you guys had seen the event, the Facebook event, you may have noticed that it was put on by this organization called the TaHa Collective. Now, many people might be wondering, what is this TaHa Collective? I've never heard of it before. There's a good reason for that, because we just started this organization. So this is a brand new organization. And here to describe the purpose of this organization, why it was created, what our goals are, what we plan to do with this organization, I'd like to invite up here one of the founders, Brother Imran Iba. So, again, one more salawat for him.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So, as Irzza mentioned, my name is Imran. Before we get started, actually, I have to say, as Irzza was saying, this is our inaugural event, and mashallah, we're surprised at the turnout ourselves. So, perhaps just by a quick show of hands, can I see how many of you heard about the event on the Boston area Shia Muslims WhatsApp page? Right. And what about the Facebook posts that had gone out? Okay, very good. And how many of you are here because you know Irzza? If you guys don't know Irzza out here, by the way, he's a good guy to know. He seems to know. He's been here for about 2 months, 3 months? 5 months. Okay. Irzza knows a surprising number of people. So very good. So as we're mentioning, so the TaHa Collective, this concept of an organization, where did it come about from? Actually, the genesis is actually fairly simple. So I myself have been in the Boston area for about 2 years now. I moved here from Philadelphia. And I think shortly thereafter, Sadiq, and I've known Sadiq, who's our speaker today, from our days in Philadelphia. that we both work in Kendall Square. We're both in the life science sector. And so we used to get together along with the Abbas Ghazmi, who's in the back here, who I've known for a couple of years as well. And we used to get together in Kendall Square every so often just to network and get to know people. And slowly that group has been growing as well. And we called ourselves unofficially the Kendall Shia Lunch Group, or I think we tend to meet every so often. Yasser al-Wakil, who isn't here today, he's traveling, moved from San Francisco recently, as I mentioned. Irtaza, who doesn't work in Kendall Square and so isn't a member of the group, is also shown up recently. Shozaid had joined us recently as well. And so as the group started to get together, the conversation turned to this concept of, Boston is tremendous in a number of ways, and yet there's some things that we needed to work on as well. And I think in terms of the intellectual richness of not just Muslims, but in general, the Boston area is probably second to none. And the quality of the people that live in the area as well. I think, secondly, as perhaps another show of hands, how many people here have lived in the Boston area for more than 3 years? Okay, so, a fair amount of, but a fair amount of transient, there's a very transient population within Boston as well. So very smart, very intellectually rich, somewhat transient. And I think the third aspect, certainly from a Shia perspective, while there are a number of mosques or Sunnis, Imambaras in the area as well, they tend to be outside of the city core. And so for people who are looking for that spiritual guidance, alignment, and a means to really participate, you are having to find yourself having to go either outside of town, which has not always been very practical. And I think if you look at the centers, which obviously serve a very important purpose as well, that those centers were very much designed to cater to how Islam is practiced back home, for whatever back home might be. We recognize really that there's actually a space needed here for people to start exploring Islam in ways that caters more to English being the native language as opposed to whatever other language people speak at these particular centers as well. And that we can really start pushing the envelope and starting to think about topics that typically aren't covered in those type of settings, kind of the unmosque type of topics. So that was the intention behind why we thought, let's see if there's actually an interest in pulling this together. As we sat at a lunch maybe 2 months ago, maybe 3 months or so, we said, why don't we start up a WhatsApp group? That's perhaps the most logical way to do that, and see how many people we can actually recruit in this. And I think today we have something like 70, or over 70 members within that group. They're all Boston-based people that are interested in this concept. And that was essentially the idea of how we started. So as we were pulling together the TaHa initiative, and I think it'd be useful maybe just to once again point out some of the folks that have been part of this. Obviously, Sadiq, you'll hear from Irtaza as well, and Abbas Ghazmi in the back. Wade as well. But I think, and Abbas, why don't you actually maybe come up here as well. But I think as we've thought about this, and to say, there isn't a whole lot of formality, and as we're thinking about how we pull this together, what is it that we're actually trying to do? So I'm not going to read essentially this verbatim, but I think the important points here are that, spiritual, intellectual, and social growth, we think all are elements of what makes for a rich community. Focus very much in the Boston area as opposed to perhaps the greater Boston area. And then we're focusing on, the teachings and examples of Prophet Muhammad al-Islam, as well as the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet as well. So how are we going to go about doing that? And as we think about that today, in terms of our objectives and goals, certainly this is one of the events, and this is the inaugural event of the TaHa Collective, as we're calling it, but for those of you who know, we've had a couple of other events that were more social in nature over the summer as well. But today, the speaker series, for example, is an event that we think will be very powerful. As you'll hear from, and Sadiq is very modest, but as you'll hear from Sadiq as he speaks today, this is a tremendous resource, and we're very blessed to have someone like Sadiq in our community as a local Bostonian, and as well Yasser al-Wakil, who inshallah you guys will have a chance to hear as well, is very knowledgeable of the area as well. So we have quite a few local people that we think can really provide an interesting perspective, and we hope to, inshallah, bring speakers from out of town as well who can come and speak about topics that, again, typically you wouldn't be hearing about in a more natural mosque type setting. I'll perhaps just to as a source of spirituality, I think, as we've touched on as well, and maybe just to move things along, I think the community building aspect and the recognition that, it's important for all of us to, from a social perspective, to be able to spend time together as well. That's why having social events, I think, is an important aspect of that. So I will, unless Sebastian, anything else to?
No, nothing else. I think we should probably get into the program.
Yeah, so why don't we get started on the program? Sadik, why don't you, I think Italy will do justice to an introduction here that I will not.
So we're going to get started with the program now. I'm going to introduce our speaker for the night. It's been hinted at that our speaker is Dr. Sadik Qasim. Many of you probably know Dr. Sadik, but some of you may not know him. And for those who don't know him, you should first of all get to know. But also I will give you a short introduction as to who he is. So Dr. Sadik is very accomplished, mashallah. He is a scientist specializing in gene therapy and cancer immunology. He works at Novartis right here in Kendall Square. So this is a very interesting accomplishment. Sadik is scientific news editor of the international scientific journal, Human Gene Therapy. He recently selected as one of the most influential journals in medicine over the last 100 years. He's the founder of Islamic Message Foundation of New Orleans, and he's spoken at multiple universities, as well as Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Hindu organizations throughout the country. And tonight his topic will be the Islamic perspective on the theory of evolution. So let's please welcome him up with a loud salawat, and let's gain a lot from this talk, inshallah.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Assalamu alaikum. So just before we get started, I'm interested in knowing how many of you have a science background, by show of hands. Okay. And how many of you are more humanities-based, let's say? Okay. Good. So the question arises, why talk about evolution? Why make this the kickoff event? Evolution is an interesting topic from multiple perspectives, two of which I'll mention here tonight. The first reason is if you look at worldwide acceptance of evolution, and this is a recent survey that was completed, on average, countries with Muslim predominant populations tend to rank towards the bottom. So this is a survey from roughly 9-10 years ago, and here you have a listing of so-called Western countries, and the only Muslim majority country on the list was Turkey. And as you can see by the arrow, Turkey falls all the way at the bottom of this particular survey, but it's comparable to the United States. So when you look at other countries besides Turkey, for example, this is a more recent survey looking at belief in evolution, here including countries as varied as Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Egypt. You'll see that on average, roughly greater than 50% of the Muslim majority populations disbelieve in the concept of evolution. So probably the highest believer here is Kazakhstan. So the first reason to talk about evolution is that it seems that compared to the other nations of the world, Muslim majority countries tend to have a greater disbelief in the concept of evolution. So there's this vacuum, I would say, about what evolution means and how it's sort of interpreted within the Muslim world. And in this vacuum, what you have is you have some various perspectives that are, I would say, anomalies within the perspective of Islam. Specifically, you have people like Harun Yahya, for example, a well-known Muslim creationist who essentially takes a lot of the concepts of Christian creationism and tries to package them within a Muslim context. And so Harun Yahya, for example, is well-funded, tends to spread some of the I would say, misconceptions about Islam and evolution. So the first reason to discuss evolution is, as I mentioned, there seems to be a great deal of ignorance and misunderstanding about what evolution is and how it fits within the Muslim context. The second reason is that oftentimes Western commentators and so-called advanced scientists use evolution as a type of litmus test to differentiate between civilization and savagery. And I think the most revealing quote comes from this guy, Richard Dawkins, who has said on multiple occasions, and this is only one quote, Richard Dawkins, well-known atheist, goes on to say, it is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. Richard Dawkins, a well-known, I would say, interventionist who advocates for bombing Muslim countries, as one of the reasons that he advocates for this mentality is because this idea that the Muslim countries tend to be a little less educated and a little less intellectually advanced. So the second reason to talk about evolution is that oftentimes it's used as a litmus test by certain, I would say, nefarious interests to justify intervention and other things. So within that context, the question that we hope to answer here tonight is, what does Islam say about evolution? And we're going to address this question in 5 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about Islam and the scientific enterprise, because evolution is essentially a product of the scientific enterprise. So in order to really understand the relationship between Islam and evolution, you need to step back and more fundamentally understand the relationship between Islam and the scientific enterprise. Evolution, or the concept of evolution, doesn't occur in a vacuum. That's the first part. And the second part, I wanted to make sure that we're all starting off with the same terms, essentially. So oftentimes people throw around the term evolution, but they mean different things. So what do we mean when we talk about biological evolution? Third part, we'll break down creationism, Darwinism, and then we'll look at the history of evolutionary thought, or biological evolution within the Islamic tradition. Then, the thing that interests most people when we talk about evolution, when people talk about evolution, they're not interested in the evolution of insects or beetles or, plants. When they talk about evolution, the fundamental reason that people are interested in evolution is as it relates to humans and the emergence of humans. So in the fourth part, we'll talk about humans and evolution, and then we'll conclude with some final thoughts. So the first part, Islam and the scientific enterprise. I'd like to first start off by, outlining a fundamental principle that Islam, that the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, is not a science book. However, this does not mean that it's not a book filled with scientific insights. So there's a difference between being a pure scientific book versus a book that reveals scientific truisms for mankind to reflect upon. And this is just a very high-level summary of the nature of the Quran. People have done these surveys numerous times, and what you find is if you look at the individual verses of the Quran, you come out with something like 250 verses that are essentially legislative, or contain what we would say prescriptive verses. So for example, perform salat, go to Hajj, perform the fast. These are the types of verses that we're talking about. By contrast, nearly 750 verses talking about nature and natural phenomena. My brother Kamid, for example, recited several ayahs talking about various things like the thunder and the lightning, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, are these not signs for mankind to reflect upon? And in fact, this is a type of ayah or verse that really alludes to scientific phenomenon. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَوَلَمْ يَرَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَنَّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ كَانَتَا رَتْقًا فَفَتَقْنَاهُمَا. Have the non-believers not reflected that the earth and the heavens were unified and were joined together as one unit before we clove them asunder? This is an ayah that people have often interpreted, verse 30, chapter 21, as a allusion towards the Big Bang Theory. So the point is that the Quran is not a science book, but it urges mankind to use it as a catalyst for reflection, which leads to this commandment, which is really well known in the Quran, but unfortunately, oftentimes Muslims aren't really adhering to this prescription. In Surah Isra, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding the believers, or commanding humanity, do not believe that with which you have no knowledge. وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. Your vision, your hearing, your vision, and your heart will all be held accountable. So there's this impetus, or this commandment, to pursue observation and critical thinking, and don't just inherit knowledge by authority exclusively. Use your critical faculties, which leads to some of the early important milestones that we need to really discuss before we get into the topic of evolution. The New York Times, at the end of the last millennium, had an article called "The Best Idea, Eyes Wide Open." And this is a quote from that article. The most important idea of this millennium, and they were talking at the end of the last millennium, was set in motion by a man named Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham. Ibn al-Haytham, whose anglicized name is al-Hazan, is oftentimes thought of as being one of the modern founders, or one of the modern discoverers of the scientific method, along in the West with Roger Bacon and Francis Bacon. And what Ibn al-Haytham did, and he lived shortly after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he was during the time shortly after Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. Ibn al-Haytham was by nature interested in the nature of ophthalmology and how eyes perceive images. So he would study things, and he would ask himself, how is it that the eye enables mankind to process images and to break down images? And what essentially he came up with is the modern scientific method, and I've broken it down here into 7 parts essentially, where you're going from that initial observation all the way to empirical testing, to finally reflection and essentially documenting your findings. And this, by extension, led other people. So there are other people in Muslim history that pursued this type of critical thinking and objective reasoning within the context of reflecting about nature and about the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the most influential individuals is a well-known philosopher and a polymath named Ibn Tufayl, who lived around from 1105 to 1185. He has a famous book called Hayy ibn Yaqdan, which was tremendously influential on Western European Enlightenment ideals. And if you want to actually get more understanding about Ibn Tufayl and his impact on Western Enlightenment values, I would urge you to read this book, The Vital Roots of European Enlightenment, Ibn Tufayl's influence on modern Western thought, where, among other things, Ibn Tufayl was known, his ideas were known to be cited and have influenced people as far-ranging as Newton, Kant, Rousseau, and others. So the point that I'd like to make here in the first part is that within the context of Islam, the scientific enterprise developed as a mechanism towards connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there was never really this split between religion and science as we would see in later Western civilization, as for example Galileo and other individuals. Science and religion seem to complement each other. And many of these polymaths and men of knowledge and women of knowledge as well, we didn't mention any of them here tonight, but also women of enlightenment, pursued the scientific enterprise as a means of connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Which leads us to the topic that all of you are here for tonight, which is the topic of evolution. So what do we mean when we talk about evolution? Well, oftentimes people believe this is what evolution is. So you have this linear and progressive development of mankind from a monkey. And this image is really deceptive on multiple fronts. The first reason that this image is really deceptive is because it suggests that evolution is gradual change, but it leads to more elevated forms. So in this example, for example, humans are more progressively evolved from monkeys. And then there are other issues associated with this image. So here for tonight's discussion, when we talk about evolution, I want you to get this idea out of your head. What we're talking about with respect to evolution is this concept. And there are three important points that we need to point out here. The first aspect of biological evolution would state that organisms all derive from a common ancestor, which is an important point here highlighted by this figure. So here you have a common ancestor that then splits into various branches that develop according to individual selective pressures. So for example, you have mutations and you have changes in underlying DNA and genetics. Those changes and selective pressures over time add up and cause entire emergence of species. So when we talk about evolution, this is the concept that I want you to keep in mind for tonight's discussion. That evolution results in multiple branches from a common descendant. Secondly, evolution, as envisioned or as commonly taught in the scientific textbooks, is a process that proceeds over millions and billions of years. So simply put, biological evolution, and when we talk about biological evolution here, we're talking about descent with modification. That with each generation, you're getting slight changes in the genetic makeup and in the phenotypes that manifest themselves from these genetic changes, which leads over time to the descent of different species from a common ancestor. And within the context of evolution, essentially what's often taught is that all living things are subject to and the product of two fundamental forces, variation and selection. Variation often occurs at the genetic level, where you have random and non-random events that cause changes in the genetic makeup. And these are often influenced by either environmental effects or either by some underlying genetic effects. Secondly, there's the force of selection. So over time, you start off with various selective pressures that cause certain species or certain organisms to thrive and certain species and certain organisms to essentially go extinct. And some of these selective pressures, for example, are natural selection, sexual selection, artificial selection. The reason that Darwin really has emerged as a central figure in the history of evolutionary thought is because he essentially defined the emergence of new organisms or new species via the mechanism of natural selection. So this is in his book On the Origin of Species. But there are, of course, other selective pressures. So that's those are the terms that tonight's discussion will proceed from. That's the framework that we really want to pursue. So then it gets us to the third part: creationism, Darwinism, and the history of evolution within Islam. So all of this seems straightforward. So why is it? What are some of the criticisms of evolution from the creationist perspective? Well, there are three, I would say, common criticisms of evolution from the creationist perspective. What I wanted to do for the next few minutes is address each of these and see what Islam says about these, whether Islam considers these criticisms null, or whether Islam, within the context of historical and modern-day evolutionary and theological thought, considers these criticisms legitimate. The first criticism that often gets put forth by young Earth creationists is that the Earth is thousands of years old, maybe at most 6,000 years old. So evolution claims that the world is 6 billion years old. So by virtue of what the sacred books say compared to what the archaeological and fossil evidence says, a lot of creationists disbelieve in evolution for this reason, that the Earth is thousands of years old. These fossils are made up. They really have no meaning. Some scientists maybe put them together. What does Islam say with respect to time? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah 27, chapter 27, ayah 47, beautifully says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَإِنَّ يَوْمًا عِنْدَ رَبِّكَ كَأَلْفِ سَنَةٍ مِمَّا تَعُدُّونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and indeed a day with your Lord is like 1,000 years of which you count. Meaning here, the concept that's being elicited or being articulated for me is that time is relative. Meaning, what we perceive as being a long term in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually a very short or very finite term. So Islam, and multiple verses, outlines and articulates and establishes this fundamental principle that time is relative, that this concept of the earth has to be thousands of years really has no scientific or no theological basis in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. For if a day with your Lord is like 1,000 years of which you count, you can quickly understand and appreciate this concept of time being finite for mankind, but infinite for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what does Islam say with regard to that the earth being thousands of years? Well, time is relative, and there are multiple verses. I've only listed one verse here. So what's the second common criticism of creationists with respect to evolution? Well, the second common criticism is that organisms are not derived from a common ancestor, meaning there is a repertoire of organisms in the back, and every once in a while they emerge, but they're emerging from a pre-created or a predefined variety of organisms. They're not just spontaneously emerging over time. So what does Islam say with respect to this second concept, that organisms are not derived from a common ancestor? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, throughout the Quran, specifically mentions the common origins of all of creation. And this is, I think, one of the most beautiful ayahs or verses within the Quran. And I'll just highlight one of the meanings here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاللَّهُ خَلَقَ كُلَّ دَابَةٍ مِّن مَاءٍ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created every animal from water. And then Allah goes on to say, there are some that creep on their bellies, some that walk on 2 legs, and some that walk on 4. Inna Allah ala kulli shay'in qadir. Allah creates what He wills, for verily Allah has power over all things. Meaning this verse and many other verses within the Quran allude to the common origins of all organisms on earth, ranging from the bacteria to the viruses to the birds to the chimpanzees to the humans. In fact, if we take this idea even further, there are various Muslim scholars and polymaths and philosophers that have really elaborated on this idea. This is one specific book that I would turn your attention to. It's a famous Muslim scientist and philosopher from the 10th century, who died approximately in the year 943. His name is Muhammad al-Naqshbandi, and he has a book called Kitab al-Mahsul, which is a 21-volume book that talks about various things, including the creation or the origin of the universe. Now, the problem, unfortunately, with this book is that really it's not found in a complete set. Bits and pieces of it have been lost over time. So really what we have left to us is what's been transmitted through other books, because many books actually cite this work during the 10th, 11th, and 12th century of the Common Era. Muhammad al-Naqshbandi has really some very interesting observations that talk about life deriving from a common source. He says, for example, while man has sprung from sentient creatures such as animals, these have sprung from vegetal beings such as plants, and these in their turn from combined substances, these from elementary qualities, these from celestial bodies, these from the universal soul. Meaning, when you look at it, the common denominator among all of organisms ultimately goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah says, kun fayakun, say, and it becomes. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may be talking about. The fact that all organisms on earth today derive from a common ancestor. And again, as I said, unfortunately, there are only bits and pieces of this book that are available in fairly classical Arabic. So if you really want to get more insight into Muhammad al-Naqshbandi and some of his writings, I would turn your attention to this book, The Fatimids and Their Traditions of Learning, by a famous Orientalist named Heinz Holm. So the second idea that other organisms are not derived from a common ancestor. Well, there are numerous verses within the Quran, and there are numerous classical Muslim traditions that actually negate this concept. That, we were all created uniquely. That, in fact, everything on earth derives from a common source. And I've listed the ayahs here that I've mentioned as well. So this leads us to the third common criticism of creationists with regard to evolution. Organisms, especially humans, have fixed forms, meaning the human that you see in front of us, the one that you see in the mirror, essentially has always been this way and has never really changed. What does Islam say about this? I would turn your attention, and this leads us to the third part of the talk, which is where we talk about evolution and the concept of humans. For this talk, I would turn your attention to a beautiful tradition of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, and you can find this tradition in Bihar al-Anwar, and you can also find it online. It's been translated into numerous languages, called the tradition of Mufaddal. And here we're talking about organisms, especially humans, have fixed forms. First, I'm going to talk about organisms in general, then we're going to talk about humans with regard to this concept. So what does Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq say? And this is a beautiful tradition called the tradition of Mufaddal. And what it is, essentially, is one day an atheist came to the masjid of the Prophet in Medina, and he wanted to engage in debate with Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is considered essentially the great, I would say, founder and initiator of Islamic scholarship. Him and his father, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, back in the 8th and 9th centuries. So in the tradition of Mufaddal, what happened is an atheist comes to the masjid of the Prophet, or the mosque of the Prophet, and he wants to engage Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq in a debate about the nature of creation and about the nature of life. And what Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq does over a series of 4 lectures is he talks to his companion, Mufaddal ibn Umar, and he outlines the creation and the peculiarities of numerous species, from the honeybee to the birds to the other organisms to humans. And in this tradition, really a very nice quote, he says, "Thus all the peculiarities of a bird's creation conform to its environment and its manner of life." Meaning here the concept is that the bird here adapts to its specific environmental condition and is not necessarily created in a fixed form. In fact, if you go even further, there's, I would say, more elaboration by a famous scholar, a Muslim scholar in the city of Basra, the Iraqi city of Basra. This scholar elaborates further on the ideas that were outlined by Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq in his book of the tradition of Mufaddal. This scholar's name is Al-Jahiz. And again, he was a well-known scholar in the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era. And he put together a beautiful book, which you can find the English translation of, called Kitab al-Haywan, which is roughly translated as the Book of Living Things or the Book of Animals. And Al-Jahiz was a man of East African descent who migrated to the city of Basra sometime in the 7th or 8th, sometime in the 8th century. And this is really an amazing book on multiple levels, but probably the most notable features of this book is that 1,000 years roughly before the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, what Al-Jahiz does very eloquently is he outlines a mechanism of evolution based on these 3 principles. The first principle being the struggle for existence, the second principle being the transformation of species, and the third principle being the influence of the environment on the emergence of new creatures and new organisms and new species. In fact, Rebecca Stott has really written a remarkable book about the contribution of Al-Jahiz to evolutionary thought, and she calls this his ideas the most remarkably advanced 1,000 years before the publication of Darwin. And I would urge you to look at this book, Darwin's Ghosts. But if you look at Kitab al-Haywan, Al-Jahiz mentions numerous things which I think we would essentially identify with modern-day biological evolution. He goes on to say that animals engage in a struggle for existence, for resources, to avoid being eaten and to breed. Environmental factors influence organisms to develop new characteristics, to ensure survival, thus transforming into new species. Meaning there are various selective pressures on animals that enable them to emerge as new species over years. So we get to the third concept, to the fourth concept, which is here. We're looking at the concept of humans within this whole scheme of evolution. Where do humans fit? Because, you may be saying, well, this is all fine and well. Birds are adapting, insects are adapting, these things are evolving. Where does humanity? Surely humans are special compared to some of these more common organisms. So what does classical Islam say? And what does some of the modern, I would say, Muslim thoughts say? We're going to discuss this in the fourth part. In the fourth part, with regard to human evolution, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in numerous places in the Quran alludes to mankind being created in stages. Now this has been interpreted in different ways depending on the mufassir or the interpreter. For example, here in Surah 171, Ayah 14, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَدْ خَلَقَكُمْ أَطْوَارًا, and seeing that He has created you in diverse stages. Now this ayah has been interpreted one of two ways. The first way is that the diverse stages refer to the diverse stages within the embryo. So you go from a zygote to a fetus, to an embryo, to a fetus, and what have you. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation that's been put forward is that the human form that we know today evolved over many years. And in fact, the humans that we refer to as mankind today are not necessarily the humans that have preceded us. Essentially, we're variants of a different species of hominid, or a different species of the group Homo. In fact, if you look in Bihar al-Anwar, and these are two traditions that I want to bring to your attention that have been highlighted by Allama Tabatabai in an essay which you can find in the following book, which you can probably come up. But if you want the original Arabic, I can give you the reference in the books of Bihar al-Anwar. Here, the first tradition dates from a few generations after the death of the Prophet, from Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, where he says, God be exalted, since creating the world, has created 7 kinds, none of whom were the race of Adam. He created them from the surface of the earth and set them being one after another with its kind upon the earth. Then He created Adam, the father of mankind, and brought his children into being from him. Meaning that the form that we know of as Adam today is not necessarily the same form that has always existed on the face of the earth. And this, by the way, these traditions are also listed in 2 books of tafsir that I would like to bring to your attention. The first book is a common book called Tafsir al-Kabir of al-Razi, who has mentioned this tradition within the context of chapter 2, verses 30 to 33. And I was talking with my brother Asim earlier about these verses, wherein Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks with the angels and tells them, I'm going to put a vicegerent on the earth, essentially a khalifa on earth. And then the angels counter by saying, are you going to put someone who's going to spread blood and cause mischief on the face of the earth? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I know that which you do not know. And then Allama Tabatabai and Al-Razi go into detail explaining the interpretation of these ayahs by mentioning these traditions. The second tradition, which I think is even more direct, comes from Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, the son of Imam al-Baqir, where he says, perhaps you think God has not created a humanity other than you. No, I swear to God that He has created thousands upon thousands of mankind, and you are the last among them. Meaning, the concept of humans, or Homo sapiens as we know it today, maybe is not something that we should just assume has always occurred in this way. So these traditions I bring to your attention because they really would cause us to really reflect about what's being said. What about in contemporary times? So you may say, oh yeah, that's all fine and well, that's from the 7th century. What about in modern times? What have Muslim scholars said about this? For this, I'm going to highlight 2 specific examples and bring to your attention human evolution within contemporary Muslim thought. First, I'd like to bring to your attention this summit that occurred approximately 3 years ago in England. It was sponsored by the Dean Institute. And you can find this online. So if you don't like to read, you can maybe, if you have maybe 5 or 6 hours, you can download this on YouTube and watch it. And what this was a one-day summit where they tried to answer the question, have Muslims misunderstood evolution? And they included 4 different speakers who came from a range of perspectives. From this guy, Dr. Osama Hassan, to Sheikh Yasser Qalbi, who's somewhat of a, I would say, a more traditional Muslim scholar, to Professor Fatima Jackson, to Dr. Akhtar Babuna, who's one of the disciples or one of the followers of Harun Yahya. And I would turn your attention to this because it seems at the end of the talk, with the exception of Dr. Akhtar Babuna, all of them essentially converge on the consensus that evolution, or biological evolution as it applies to humans, is applicable and is not necessarily exclusive of Islam. But then I would like to bring to your attention another really fabulous work. It's a fabulous book by 2 scholars of Islam from the 80s. Both of them were assassinated by various agents, who were opposed to some of their, I would say, principles after the revolution in Iran. The books are The Philosophy of Islam. The book is The Philosophy of Islam, and it was written by these 2 scholars, Sayyid Bihishti and Sheikh Bahunar. And in this book, The Philosophy of Islam, they look at Muslim philosophy from multiple perspectives. And they dedicate an entire section or an entire chapter on the concept of humans and evolution. And I think they have some really revealing and fantastic quotes within this book. And it's just a generally good book. It's readily accessible. It's available as PDF format if you search it on Google. So what Bahunar and Bihishti conclude is that the emergence of man on the basis of evolution from other primates is not in conflict with the teachings of the revealed religions, especially with the belief of an almighty creator of the world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then they go on to say that incidentally, the principles of evolution are still subject to further scientific investigation, for they are faced with much criticism, especially as they were enunciated by Darwin. The take-home message, as I interpret it from the writings of Bahunar and Bihishti, is that evolution is a potential mechanism that describes the emergence of mankind and Homo sapiens within the framework of evolution by natural selection. However, we shouldn't just take the concept of evolution wholesale, whole cloth, and essentially believe in it as a religion on high authority. And this is where I think the clash essentially occurs between a lot of the fundamentalist Darwinian evolutionists, and I would say some of the more traditional, believers. Because, within the concept of Darwinian evolution, oftentimes people like Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss and others often present evolution as if it completely describes everything about human existence, from the origins of the universe to the purpose of mankind. And they do this with such arrogance and authority that if you were a non-specialist, you would say, well, good Lord, the decks are stacked against religion and Islam. But if you actually, critically look at the evidence, sometimes it's incomplete, sometimes it's imperfect, and oftentimes it doesn't necessarily say what they interpret it to say. Which brings us back to that original ayah that I mentioned at the beginning, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. Do not believe that with which you have no knowledge, for verily your hearing, your sight, and your heart will all be held accountable. Evolution, just like any other idea in science, should be subject to critical thought and to objective reasoning. I'm just going to give you 2 examples of what I mean here by the deficiencies of evolution. So up until maybe 5 years ago, there was a fantastic work published in the journal Science. This is back in 2009. And up until 2009, it was thought that the common ancestor of humans was this organism called Lucy, that commonly was referred to as Lucy. What happened in 2009 is they found some new fossils, some new fossil evidence that actually suggested that our least common, that our common ancestor was not Lucy, but in fact was 1 million years older than Lucy. So here the evolutionary framework was off by 1 million years. That's number one. Secondly, up until 2009, the common prevailing belief in Darwinian evolution is that we derived from a common ancestor that was chimpanzee, that resembled the chimpanzee in its physiology and its genetics. But the emergence of Ardi, which is this fossil right here, which they reconstructed into this figure right here, what it suggested is actually modern Homo sapiens does not derive from a chimpanzee-like ancestor, but actually split off into this other type of primordial form, which looks nothing like a chimpanzee. So I bring this picture, this idea to you for two reasons. Number one, the archaeological and fossil evidence is incomplete. And oftentimes what's taught is it's taught as its complete religion, as if everything is settled. But what you're finding on a regular basis, and just last week they found a new common ancestor in Spain. What you're finding is continually this reevaluation and redevelopment of evolutionary biology models that negate what was previously taught. Secondly, I want to bring to your attention the amount of creative interpretation that often takes place with respect to fossils and to archaeological evidence. So this is the fossils that they discovered in Africa. This is the reconstruction that they came up with. Now, when you actually look at the methods that they used to reconstruct the species, I'm not really sure how they came up that, Ardi looked like this based on these bones, because there's nothing, and they didn't do any sequencing, for example, that would tell you that the organism would be hairy. They didn't do any sequencing to tell you that, it would have this type of features. So there's a lot of creative interpretation, even within the concept of the fossil evidence. Which gets back to the point. Don't just believe things based on authority. Always have critical questioning and objective reasoning. Finally, I'd like to just mention this in conclusion, and then we'll wrap up with maybe some questions and answers. The second thing that evolution does not really account for fully is the uniqueness of humans with respect to various fundamentally uniquely human attributes. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah 17 or chapter 17, verse 85 says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ, and they ask you about the soul. قُلْ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the soul. Say, the soul is one of the commands of my Lord, and you are not given aught of knowledge but a little. You're only given a little knowledge about the soul. I bring this up because evolutionary biology does not account, nor will it ever account, for this concept of the soul. It's based on the nature of the evidence that comes out. You can never really identify the origin of the soul or the genesis of the soul, and you can never really fully account for the soul within the paradigm or the framework of modern evolutionary biology. The soul is only one thing that evolution doesn't account for. Another thing that evolution doesn't account for example, is the ability to speak language. Noam Chomsky had a beautiful essay 2 weeks ago in the journal PLOS Biology that I would urge you to look at. And in this journal, in this particular article, he says that modern evolutionary biology, with respect to natural selection, does not account for the language faculty, meaning this ability to speak or this ability to communicate using the language. It can never be accounted for by evolution. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَعَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانِ, and He's taught mankind the ability to communicate in Surah Al-Rahman. I just want to conclude with this final quote from another individual who was the co-describer of evolution in addition to Darwin. But unfortunately, this individual often gets overlooked. But I think what he has to say about evolution is really highly relevant to what we've discussed here today. And that's this man, Alfred Russel Wallace. All of us are familiar with Charles Darwin and his book on the origin of species. But as many of you know, at the time of Darwin's publication, there was a younger contemporary of Darwin, a man named Alfred Russel Wallace, who, by the way, interestingly, his assistant was a man named Ali. So Alfred Russel Wallace had a Muslim assistant that helped him to collect fossil evidence during his expeditions in Mali. And there's actually some really interesting works and some interesting journal references that Alfred Russel Wallace has about Ali, his contemporary or his assistant in collecting the fossil evidence. But anyway, what does Alfred Russell Wallace say? Well, he essentially echoes what the Quran says. Nothing in evolution can account for the soul of man. The difference between man and the other animals is unbridgeable. Mathematics is alone sufficient to prove in man the possession of a faculty unexistent in other creatures. Then you have music and the artistic faculty. No, the soul was a separate creation. Again, a lot of creative interpretation with respect to evidence. Alfred Russel Wallace looked at the evidence and concluded that the soul was a unique creation. Darwin looked at the evidence and concluded that it was not a unique creation. And this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala urges mankind to use their critical reasoning to actually come up with the conclusion. So to conclude, what does Islam say about evolution? Well, I really dislike, coming up with a conclusion or representing, 1.5 billion, 2 billion people and saying, well, what does Islam say about evolution? But what I hope that I've convinced you of here today is that there's a long legacy of critical reasoning within the Muslim tradition, all the way from the time of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir to Ibn al-Haytham, to Ibn Tufayl, to in modern times, the people that participated in the Evolution Summit, to Sayyid Bahishti and Bahunar. And what Islam says about evolution is what it says about everything else. Use your critical reasoning and try to judge based on the evidence. If you do this, you'll notice that evolution accounts for certain things, but it doesn't account for other things. Either way, the belief in evolution does not negate the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or in a higher creator. And with that, I conclude and I'll open it up for any questions. And this is my email. If you'd like to ask any questions or what have you, feel free to reach out. Yes.
You mentioned one of the traditions that said that there were many humanities before us. Do we know if Adam was of the same type of humanity as us, or if he was a previous version of species?
Yeah, see, that's a good question, and that people often ask that question. We don't really know. I mean, for example, there's a lot of unknowns, and I think the problem that we enter into is when we try to say, okay, well, for example, Ardi is the closest relative, or something like that. So unfortunately, within the Muslim tradition, I don't think that's really been examined, and even if it was examined, it would really be difficult to come up with a solid answer that's not based in speculation. Yes?
So based on Islam, what Allah calls the children of Adam and Eve, is this consistent with the theory of evolution? Can be justified?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and this is what I sort of alluded to here earlier. If you look at the writings, you have to define where Adam and Eve essentially started, right? And so, I would say that we're all derived from a common parents, Adam and Eve, but the idea is that we don't really know anything beyond that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that they were in heaven, and then they were, essentially exiled into earth, but we don't actually know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means within this context. And if you look at the tafasir and what people like Bahunar and Bahishti and others refer to, I think that's, we know that we come all from a common origin, and that we all come from an Adam and an Eve, and that's essentially what we can conclude. Yes?
Thanks for the answer. Actually, you mentioned that in a way, Islam does not have any conflicts when it comes to evidence, especially now. It does not have any conflict like in believing in God. Evolution might be true, and Islam doesn't have any like back to the conflict between the evolutionists and the creationists, like where the people create. And this is maybe one of the critical points, like this should open all go back to this, like how things were started, how like is a, let's say that hypothetically there will be more proofs about that path. Are we going to be able to also use evidences to change our perspectives and our beliefs, or how normally, what are the solid things about Islam when it comes to evolution?
So again, what I wanted to highlight is that there are no, I would say, solid things about Islam regarding evolution. The only solid thing that we can say is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses a mechanism for creating species or creating organisms, and this may be evolution, may explain it. But the idea is that evolution by itself doesn't tell you anything about the origin of the universe. And that's what I think is the problem, that you have people like Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss trying to use this concept of biological evolution to explain cosmological phenomena. And this is actually an idea that's been highlighted numerous times. For example, I have this slide that I didn't present here. With regard to the universe, I would say that if you believe that the universe is billions of years old, it doesn't matter whether you're a scientist or a believer. These are essentially the events that occurred. So here you have the Big Bang, and then immediately afterwards you have the expansion of the universe, right? Which I alluded to in the verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَفَتَّقْنَاهُمَا فَتْقًا. We've expanded, we split them together. What evolution cannot tell you, evolution can't tell you about anything of this. And specifically the point that I'm talking about is that here after the Big Bang Theory, you have this period from 0 to 10 to the minus 43 seconds, which is called the Planck era. And you see here question marks. The reason that there are question marks here is because science can never tell you about the way that the universal principles were established, with regard to the universe. And this is something that, people like Dawkins and others concedes to, that there's no way to really come up with evidence to tell us what happened in this essential period of time. And so this is really where the evolutionists and the creationists essentially use the evidence to interpret what happened here. The evolutionists would say that this all happened by random chance and random associations, even though there's really no evidence for that. Whereas the people who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say this is where the universal principles of Allah were essentially established for the universe. So the point being that no one can use evolution to prove or disprove Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you can never use scientific evidence to prove or disprove the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeatedly mentions, that it's not the eyes that become blind. It's the hearts that become blind. So ultimately, it doesn't matter what evidence you have. It's not the eyes that will ultimately believe, but it's rather this cultivation of the heart, or this connection that will enable you to connect. And that's essentially my point. Yes?
Thank you so much. It's a very deep engagement. Now you're concluding engagement with soul. But there are different ways of being with soul. For example, how soul itself is a relational journey as it relates to body, mind, spirit. So if we have a relational realization of soul, then that relational dynamics of soul is not totally away from the dynamics of body, for example. So my submission is that we have to rethink soul as a relational journey, and therefore certain aspects of the evolutionary journey is helpful. On a cross-cultural perspective, of course, you very admirably draw on the Islamic sources, but I would draw your attention to similar sources. For example, TaHa from the Christian tradition, and Sri Aurobindo from India, who has deeply reflected on rethinking evolution. And of course, evolutionary biologists like Dobzhansky, who wrote this book, Biology of the Ultimate Concern. So we can build upon these multiple sources to deepen and widen, including question the story of the evolution that you are urging us to realize.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and we could, I thank you for bringing our attention to those sources. And of course, I only approached the concept of evolution from the Muslim perspective, but like you've mentioned, there are numerous sources outside of Islam that also, discuss the concepts that we talked about from a slightly different lens. And I think all of them conclude that there are certain unexplainable elements within evolution. For example, Francis Collins and others have talked about this. So, unfortunately, the time was limited, so we could only really, but that's a really notable point. Yes?
As you mentioned in the Quran, there's really not a lot of detail about Adam and Eve as far as like an entire detailed story about what happened. And I've often found Muslims kind of filling in the gaps with the Judeo-Christian story, where you have Adam and Eve going to Earth and then having children, and their children having children with each other, and therefore creating an entire human race. Is there anything in any Islamic traditions that would suggest that there were, at the arrival of Adam and Eve on Earth, that there were proto-humans already existing there with whom they intermixed with and created the rest of us as the modern humans?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with any of those types of traditions, but that's something to consider, I think, that with the emergence of Adam and Eve, that there were other proto-Adams and Eves already in existence. That's something to look into. But I haven't run across any. I don't know if anyone's run across any types of traditions. Thanks. Yes.
The verses that you quoted about, like Allah creating everything from water and stages. I mean, the stages, creating everything in stages is itself creating humans presumably in stages could refer to just as well, as you pointed out, in fact, the stages of like the embryo and everything. And also creating everything from water. I mean, everything is made up of water. Anyone who works with anchovies and dried fruits and everything knows that, right? So it could just as easily refer to the common designer creating using the same construction material, which would stand just as well if evolution was bunkum, was proven to be bunkum. So, I mean, I'm just not seeing anything that goes one way or the other,
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's
doesn't really support evolution. It doesn't really make a statement of.
So, what I hope to have done here is that, demonstrating some of the sources that some of the classical Muslim thinkers used as a source of inspiration for their own studies, right? Like, for example, when Al-Jahiz talks about the survival of, or the competition of different species, he's using the same Quranic source to come up with that conclusion. When Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq or Imam al-Baqir talk about hundreds of atoms or thousands of atoms before, they're using the same source. And I think that's the issue that's at hand here, is that a lot of these ayahs are subject to interpretation, and sometimes they're misinterpreted if they're not viewed within the broader Muslim tradition. And I think, like you've alluded to, those ayahs could be interpreted one way, but then the Quran is not a book that's simply fixed in its interpretation. And this is something that I think, unfortunately, is many modern Muslims simply rely on the classical tafsir of, for example, Al-Razi or Al-Zamakhshari. But you have these more, I would say, recent tafsirs, like Allama Tabatabai. When he talks about Surah 2, Ayah 30s through 33, he's reinterpreting it within a modern context. And that's the point of the Quran, is that it's a continually interpreted book based on the evidence that's available. And there's really no exclusive avenue for, saying, well, this is the only interpretation. Because in fact, that's the point of Islamic theology. That's why we have multiple schools of thought. All of the schools of thought look at the same evidence and they come up with different interpretations. So why is it that we, don't come up with the same conclusion when it comes to the natural phenomena, right? So that's essentially what I'm trying to conclude here. That you have a set ayah, but it's subject to different interpretations based on one's perspective and one's background. So Allama Tabatabai looks at Surah 2, ayahs 30 to 33, and mentions the traditions that I've alluded to here. Someone just as easily could look at those verses and say, no, these traditions adhere to this phenomenon. Yes?
Yeah, I thought it's good to mention this hadith from Imam Jafar. This is from the book Untitled Chapter. So a man asked Imam Jafar about the paradise of Adam. The Imam answered, it was a garden from the gardens of this world. The sun and the moon would ride over it. If it were from the garden of eternity, he would have never left it. So it looks that heaven, that paradise was on earth.
Yeah, exactly. And so you see here this tradition that my brother Nima comes up with. When we think of heaven, we think of this thing which is fixed in the sky. But again, that subject, I mean, what's the basis for that? Yeah, maybe that's one interpretation. Yes?
No, can you go to the slide where you show that? Yeah, that one. So then can you see that at some point in this, that Adam and Eve were created and put on the earth? Is there like because the Quran describes in very more detail the creation of Adam than other creatures, and there's a whole story around that. Is that something that you?
Well, see that's
there were all these other primates there, and then all of a sudden, Allah fashioned Adam, gave him the soul, and put him on earth.
See, so that's a very intriguing sort of exercise. Like, let's find which branch here is Adam.
Is there a branch there, or is there basically a new branch? Is there a new line there? Not connected to.
That's the question, and I think to answer your question, I would refer you to this from Sermon 186 from Imam Ali Najib Balagha, where he says, "Speak about the creation of Allah and do not speak about Allah. For discourse about Allah will bring nothing but confusion to the speaker." And this, I think, is relevant here. I mean, we don't know really the mechanism that Allah used to.
I'm not talking about the mechanism. I'm just saying that was it a discrete event that it just occurred? I'm not saying how it was done. I'm just saying.
And exactly, and that's what I'm saying. The fossil evidence will never tell you where it is in the branch that this occurred. I mean, you can never really definitively say that it's at this. With this fossil evidence, that this is where the soul emerged.
Did it occur somewhere?
Well, this is one of the interpretations of Behishti and Bahunam, that you essentially have this primate, hominid type of creature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blew his ruh into, and that's where the soul was created, and maybe that's where Adam and Eve were essentially placed on earth and the heaven when this transaction between Allah, the divine spirit, and humans occurred. But again, that's subject to speculation. We really don't know where it could be within this lineage. And I don't think we'll ever find evidence for it. Yes?
But if the heavens and the earth were joined together and cloven asunder, as you mentioned earlier, then and heaven was also on earth, so what? Doesn't that seem to contradict?
Well, the heavens and earth were joined together 6 billion years ago. Humans emerged 600,000 years ago, so that doesn't necessarily negate it.
No, we're talking about paradise as heaven on earth, right? So is that the same heaven? We're talking about heavens and earth being cloven?
It's two different words.
Yeah, it's two different words. So here the heavens, I think we're talking about the word, the heavens as in the modern sense of the universe, and the earth essentially, we're all united together. The heavens that we're talking about, the other heavens, is more of the, I would say, the metaphorical or the origin of Adam. But to conclude, I think the time is running late. To conclude, I think we have to leave here in a few minutes. I'm just pointing at his watch. But to conclude here, there's a long legacy within Islam of viewing what we would say modern day evolution from numerous classical sources and even modern sources. And evolution does not negate the existence of a creator, essentially. And if you have any questions, go read for yourself and come up with, go see what you come up with. Salawat.
Just a comment to the organizer.